Thank you very much. All of us, from time to time, ask some deep and difficult questions. Why is the world filled with woe? How do we make it better? How do we give meaning and purpose to our lives? Well, as difficult as these questions may be, many people have answers to them. For example, morality is dictated by God in Holy Scriptures. When everyone obeys his laws, the world will be perfect. Or, problems are the fault of evil people who must be shamed and defeated. Our tribe should claim its rightful greatness under the control of a strong leader who embodies its authentic virtue. Or, in the past, we lived in a state of order and harmony until alien forces brought on decadence and degeneration. We must restore the society to its golden age. Well, what about the rest of us? Many people know what they don't believe in, but have a much more difficult time identifying what they do believe in. So I argue in Verlichting Nu, Enlightenment Now, that there is a coherent system of alternative and values and beliefs that we associate with the Enlightenment, namely that we can use knowledge to enhance human flourishing. Many people embrace the ideals of the Enlightenment without realizing it, without being able to name or describe them. As a result, they've faded into the background as a kind of bland default or status quo. Other ideologies have passionate advocates, and I suggest that Enlightenment ideals too need a positive defense and an explicit commitment, and that is what I have tried to do in the book. The Enlightenment, I suggest, revolves around 4 themes: reason, science, humanism, and progress. Let me say a few words about each. It all begins with reason, with the understanding that traditional sources of belief are generators of delusion: faith, revelation, tradition, authority, charisma, mysticism, intuition, the hermeneutic parsing of sacred texts are all ways of being wrong. Reason, in contrast, is non-negotiable. As soon as you try to provide reasons why we should trust anything other than reason, as soon as you explain why you're right or why other people should believe you, that you're not lying or full of crap, you've lost the argument because you have appealed to reason. As a cognitive psychologist, I would be the first to acknowledge that human beings on their own are not particularly reasonable. We all generalize from anecdotes, we reason from stereotypes, we seek evidence that confirms our beliefs and blow off evidence that disconfirms them, and we're all overconfident about our knowledge, our wisdom, and our rectitude. But people are capable of reason if they establish certain norms and institutions: free speech, open criticism and debate, logical analysis, fact-checking, and empirical testing, which leads to the second Enlightenment ideal, science. Science is based on the conviction that the world is intelligible and that we can seek to understand it by formulating possible explanations and testing them against reality. Science has shown itself to be our most reliable means of understanding the world, including ourselves. An important Enlightenment principle was that there can be a science of human nature, and that beliefs about society are testable, just like any other beliefs about the world. The third ideal is humanism, that the ultimate moral purpose is to reduce the suffering and enhance the flourishing of human beings and other sentient creatures. Well, enhancing human flourishing, who could be against that, you might think? In fact, there are alternatives to humanism, such as that the ultimate good is to enhance the glory of the tribe, the nation, the race, the class, or the faith, to obey the dictates of a divinity and pressure others to do the same, to achieve feats of heroic greatness, or to advance some mystical force or struggle or dialectic or pursuit of utopian or messianic age. Humanism is feasible because humans are endowed with a sense of sympathy, a concern with the welfare of others. By default, our circle of sympathy is rather small. We tend to feel the pain only of our close biological relatives, our friends, our allies, maybe cute little furry baby animals, and that's about it. But our circle of sympathy can be expanded through cosmopolitanism, the mixing of people and ideas, through education, journalism, art, mobility, and even pure reason. As soon as I engage in discussion with you, I can't insist that only my interests are special because I'm me and you're not, and hope for you to take me seriously. Finally, we get to the ideal of progress, that if we apply knowledge and sympathy to reduce suffering and enhance flourishing, we can gradually succeed. So, 250 years later, how did that Enlightenment thing work out? I have found that if you ask most intellectuals, the answer is not very well, because I have discovered that intellectuals hate progress. And intellectuals who call themselves progressive really hate progress. If you think we can solve problems, I have been told, that means you have a blind faith and a quasi-religious belief in the outmoded superstition of the false promise, of the myth of the onward march of inevitable progress. You are a cheerleader for vulgar American can-doism, with the rah-rah spirit of boardroom ideology, Silicon Valley, and the Chamber of Commerce. You are a practitioner of Whig history, a naive optimist, a Pollyanna, and of course a Pangloss, alluding to the Voltaire character who declared, "All is for the best in the best of all possible worlds." Well, as it happens, Professor Pangloss was what we would today call a pessimist. A true optimist would believe there can be much better worlds than the one that we find today. But all of that is irrelevant, because the question of whether progress has taken place is not a matter of having a sunny disposition or seeing the glass as half full. It's an empirical hypothesis. Human well-being can be measured. Life, health, sustenance, prosperity, peace, freedom, safety, knowledge, leisure, happiness. If they have increased over time, I submit, that would be progress. Let's look at the data. Beginning with the most precious thing of all, life. For most of human history, life expectancy at birth hovered around 30 years. But then with advances in medicine and public health, such as vaccination, sanitation, and antibiotics, life expectancy at birth has increased worldwide to 71 years, and in Europe and the Americas to more than 80 years. Other parts of the world have been rapidly catching up, including Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. For most of human history, the biggest contributor to low life expectancy at birth was the mortality of children. In Sweden in 1750, for example, 1/3 of children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Sweden brought its rate of child mortality down by a factor of 100, and other parts of the world have followed suit, such as in North America, Canada, in Asia, South Korea, in Latin America, Chile, and in Africa, Ethiopia. Health. For most of human history, the biggest killer of humans was infectious disease, which is no longer a source of mortality in rich countries. But in poor countries, infectious disease continues to kill many people, especially children. But over the last 15 years, the 5 most lethal infectious diseases have all been in decline: pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, measles, and HIV/AIDS. Sustenance. For most of history, humanity was unable to feed itself. For example, to grow the 2,500 calories per person per day that's necessary to feed a moderately active adult male. But with the agricultural revolution in Britain in the 18th century, advances in agronomy, such as crop rotation, later the development of fertilizers, mechanization of agriculture, and the selective breeding of vigorous hybrids, country after country developed the ability to feed itself, including more recently China, India, and the world as a whole. Now, these extra calories would be a dubious form of progress if they simply went to making fat people still fatter. But in fact, they have been used to drastically reduce the rate of undernourishment, which in 1970 afflicted 35% of people in the developing world. That has been brought down to by more than half. Beginning in Latin America, then Asia, and now sub-Saharan Africa is advancing. The most catastrophic instances of insufficient calories take place during famines. Famine was one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse and could devastate any part of Earth if there was a crop failure or a bad season. But famines now have been reduced to the point where they are not caused by a lack of food, but only an inability to bring the food to war-torn and remote regions. Prosperity. For most of human history, there was little to no economic growth. You can see this in a graph of the gross world product from the year 1 to the present, which shows that for about 1,600 years, economic growth was less than 1 pixel high. But then with the Industrial Revolution and advances in technology, developments, the spread of education, the growth of markets and finance, and then global trade, world prosperity has increased by a factor of 200 since the 18th century. The escape from universal poverty was highly uneven. Western countries like the UK and the US were the first to escape, but more recently, South Korea has shot up from poverty, as has Chile, and China and India are beginning to show exponential growth. Now, again, this increase in prosperity would not really count as progress if all of the gains were going to the proverbial 1%. But in fact, they have been applied to decimating the rate of extreme poverty, defined as the bare minimum necessary to feed oneself and one's family. By that criterion, 200 years ago, 90% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it is less than 10%. And in fact, there's been a 75% reduction in extreme poverty just in the last 30 years. Because of this, international inequality, the gap between rich countries and poor countries, after necessarily increasing during the Industrial Revolution as a few countries escaped from universal poverty, leaving the rest behind, has now begun to reverse because poor countries are getting richer faster than rich countries are getting richer, and inequality between countries is now in decline. Inequality within rich countries, of course, has been increasing, but that doesn't mean that rich countries have become indifferent to the plight of the less well-off. For most of European history, rich countries devoted no more than 1.5% of their GDP to the poor, the sick, children, and the elderly. But in the 20th century, every developed country began a program of social spending, of redistribution, with the result that a median OECD country today devotes 22% of its GDP to social transfers. As a result, even while inequality has increased, poverty has decreased when measured by income after taxes and transfers. In 1960, 33%, 1/3 of Americans fell below the poverty line. That has fallen to less than 7%. And when poverty is measured in terms of consumption, what people can afford to buy, it's fallen from 30% to 3%. Peace. For most of history, the natural state of relations between empires and large countries was war, and peace was merely a brief interlude between wars. You can see that in a graph of the percentage of years in which the great powers of the day, the major states and empires, were at each other's throats in major wars. What the graph shows is that 300 years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. Today, they are never at war. The last great power war took place 65 years ago when the United States fought China in Korea. Now, if we zoom in on the 20th century, we see that even as wars were becoming shorter and less frequent, the ones that did occur were more deadly culminating in World War I and World War II, which killed an unprecedented number of people. But contrary to predictions that I grew up with, that it was only a matter of time before we would see World War III fought with nuclear weapons between the US and the Soviet Union went out of existence mostly peacefully, and World War III never happened. In fact, if we zoom in now on the period since World War II, we see there's been an uneven but unmistakable decline in the rate of death from all wars combined, including civil wars, from 22 per 100,000 per year to 1.2 per 100,000 per year. Freedom and rights. We've all read with alarm about the retreat of democracy in countries like Russia and Turkey and Venezuela. But if you count up the number of countries that are democratic and the number that are autocratic, weighing them by how democratic or autocratic they are, you see that the world has never been more democratic than it has been in this decade. 2/3 of the world's countries are more democratic than autocratic. 2/3 of the world's population lives in democracies. Violent crime. In any part of the world that lives in a state of anarchy, there will be predation of some people by others, revenge against the predation, resulting in cycles of violence and high rates of homicide. For example, in medieval Europe, the homicide rate was 35 per 100,000 per year. Then as the medieval kingdoms established control over the feudal patchwork of fiefs, and the code of vendetta was replaced by the rule of law, every European country reduced its homicide rate by a factor of about 35. Today, most European countries have a homicide rate of 1 per 100,000 per year. And that reduction in violence is replicated in any part of the world in which governments establish control over their frontier regions and replace the code of revenge and vendetta and feuding with a court system and rule of law. It happened again in the colonial New England, in the American Wild West, and in Mexico, for example. If we zoom in on the last 50 years, we see that homicide deaths, after increasing in every Western country in the 1960s, a reversal of the decline of violence, the reversal was then reversed, and countries like the United States have recently reduced their homicide rate by half. The world as a whole has cut its homicide rate by 35% just in the last 20 years. Not just violence, not just homicide, but violence against women, such as domestic violence against wives and girlfriends, and rape and sexual assault, and the victimization of children, both bullying and other forms of violence against children at school, and physical abuse and sexual abuse by caregivers. In fact, we've been getting safer in just about every way. We are 96% less likely to die in a car crash, 88% less likely to be mowed down on the sidewalk, 99% less likely to die in a plane crash, 59% less likely to fall to our deaths, 90% less likely to drown, 92% less likely to die by fire, 92% less likely to be asphyxiated. There is one exception to the trend of increased safety, and this is the category that safety statisticians call poison by solid or liquid. It includes drug overdoses, and here you're seeing the result of the American opioid epidemic, an exception to the trend of increasing safety. At the same time, we're 95% less likely to be killed on the job. We're even less likely to die in an act of God. The droughts, floods, wildfires, heat waves, meteor strikes, and earthquakes, presumably not because God is any less angry with us, but because of improvements in forecasting disasters, in resilience of our infrastructure, and in emergency responses. And what about the quintessential act of God, the literal bolt from the blue hurled by Zeus himself? Yes, we are 97% less likely to be killed by a bolt of lightning. Knowledge. The natural state of humanity is to be illiterate, and for most of history only a privileged few could read and write, such as 15% of Europeans in the early modern period. Developed countries achieved universal literacy in the 20th century, and the developing world is following suit, including Chile, Mexico, and the world as a whole now has a rate of literacy of more than 80%, more than 90% for people under the age of 25. And in perhaps the most incredible, unbelievable, difficult to swallow example of progress at all, we have been getting smarter. Yes, this is true. In a well-documented phenomenon known as the Flynn effect, IQ scores have been increasing all over the world because of the spread of education and the proliferation of abstract concepts and visual symbols from technical domains of expertise into everyday life. Well, these are the kinds of things that economists love to measure. Do they actually improve the quality of our lives? And the answer is they do. In 1870, a typical work week in Europe and the United States was more than 60 hours. Today, it is fewer than 40. And thanks to the universal penetration of running water and electricity, and the widespread adoption of labor-saving devices like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, dishwashers, stoves, and microwaves, the amount of our lives that we waste in housework, which is the least favorite way people say of spending their time, has declined from 60 hours a week to less than 15 hours a week. If you take into account both the shorter work week and the smaller amount of our lives that we forfeit to housework, you see that the amount of leisure time has been increasing over the last 50 years, both among men and women. Now, you can't help but notice that leisure time for women has flattened out, and the reason is that women today spend more time with their children. So forget your stereotype about happy family life in the 1950s. Women today spend much more time with their children than their mothers and grandmothers did. Does it make us any happier? And the answer is it almost certainly does. There is a strong relationship between life satisfaction and income. It is a logarithmic relationship. This is a logarithmic axis, which means that an extra euro adds much more to the happiness of a poor person than a rich person. But it holds across the income scale. Each dot is a country. Each arrow is the people within a country. And what this shows is that richer countries have happier people. Within every country, richer people are happier. As the world gets richer, we should expect its people to get happier. And indeed, the data that we have on happiness over time suggests that that is true. In 85% of countries for which we have data, the rate of happiness has increased. In the World Values Survey, there are not separate data for Belgium. There are data on Belgium from the Eurobarometer, which is restricted to Europe. And Belgium is about halfway between the Netherlands and France. Belgium, over the last 40 years or so, has not had a net increase in happiness. It has since the late 90s, but it's basically Belgians are where they were in 1973. But most other countries have shown an increase. Well, I hope to have convinced you that progress is not a matter of having an optimistic disposition, but it is a demonstrable fact of human history. Indeed, the greatest fact of human history. So how is the fact of human progress reflected in the news? Well, an analysis of the news using an algorithmic count of positive and negative words in news stories shows that during all these decades in which people's lives have been getting longer and healthier and better educated and safer and more peaceful and happier, the New York Times has gotten increasingly morose, and a summary of the world's broadcasts has gotten glummer and glummer. So why do people deny progress? Part of the answer comes from our cognitive psychology. According to Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, the human brain estimates probability using a mental shortcut they called the availability heuristic. Namely, the more readily something comes to memory, the higher it is in the results list from the brain search engine, the more frequent we judge it to be. When people read about a shark attack, they think it's unsafe to go into the water. People think that tornadoes kill more people than asthma attacks, whereas it's vastly the other way around, because tornadoes are highly photogenic. They get a lot of media coverage. Asthma attacks, not so much. In fact, consider the nature of media, the nature of news. News is about stuff that happens. It's not about stuff that doesn't happen. You never see a journalist saying, I'm reporting live from a country that is at peace, or a city that has not been attacked by terrorists. As long as the rate of violence doesn't fall to zero, which it never will, there will always be enough incidents to fill the news, but we're unaware of how many countries, how many regions have become safer than they were in the past. Also, news is about sudden events, not gradual trends. Bad things can happen very quickly. A terrorist attack, a collapse of a building, a fire, a pandemic. Good things aren't built in a day, and they can sneak up on us. The newspapers could have run the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday. Every day for the last 30 years. But they never ran that headline, with the result that 1.25 billion people escaped from extreme poverty, and no one knows about it. The news media also have a demonstrable negativity bias. Editors will choose the most negative stories presented to them, according to experiments, which explains a humorous, satirical headline from the American humor newspaper, The Onion. CNN holds morning meeting to decide what viewers should panic about for the rest of the day. Well, if you combine the nature of cognition with the nature of news, you can see why the world is getting more dangerous and always has been. In fact, there is a negativity bias in human psychology more generally. Emotionally speaking, bad is stronger than good. We dread losses more than we enjoy gains, and we think about and feel bad events more than good ones, especially recent bad events. We are wired for nostalgia. Explaining an observation from Franklin Pierce Adams, nothing is more responsible for the good old days than a bad memory. There's also market incentives for profits, for pundits, for social critics. Pessimism sounds serious. Pessimists sound like they're trying to help you. Optimism sounds frivolous. Optimists sound like they're trying to sell you something. Well, let me finish up with 3 questions about progress and enlightenment that I'm sure have occurred to many of you. First is, isn't it good to be a pessimist, to make us aware of suffering and injustice, to guard against complacency? Well, not exactly. It's good to be accurate. Of course we have to know about disasters and dangers and suffering wherever they occur, but we also have to know about how they can be reduced. Because just as there may be dangers of complacency in failing to report negative events, there are dangers of indiscriminate pessimism, of omitting the positive developments. One of them is fatalism. If you think that everything is getting worse, despite all the efforts of people to make the world a better place, a natural response is, why waste money and time on a hopeless cause? Let's just enjoy ourselves while we can. Especially if we're doomed, if climate change doesn't do us in, then runaway artificial intelligence does, well then, let's eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Let our grandchildren worry about it. The other danger is radicalism. If you think that all of our institutions are failing and beyond all hopes of reform, you'll be receptive to calls to smash the machine, drain the swamp, burn the empire to the ground, or a saying that strikes a chill in the heart of every American when they heard it 2 years ago, only I can fix it. Is progress inevitable? And the answer is, of course not. Progress does not mean that everything gets better for everyone, everywhere, all the time. That wouldn't be progress. That would be magic. That would be a miracle. And progress is not a miracle. Progress consists of using knowledge to solve problems. Problems are inevitable, and solutions create new problems that must be solved in their turn. Also, there are severe global challenges that the world has not yet met. Foremost among them are climate change and the threat of nuclear weapons. I argue in the book that we should treat these as unsolved yet solvable problems rather than as apocalypses in waiting, and that we should pursue the mitigation of climate change by decarbonizing the world economy with a combination of policy, such as carbon pricing, and the development of low, zero, and negative carbon technologies, including renewables, nuclear, including fourth-generation nuclear, and carbon capture and storage. And we should forestall or minimize the risk of nuclear war by denuclearizing the world's armed forces, by first achieving a regime of international stability to safeguard against accidents and misunderstandings, and to pursue or to continue the program of arms reduction, culminating in the total elimination of all nuclear weapons. Final question: does the Enlightenment go against human nature? This is an acute question for me because I have long been a defender of the existence of a human nature. And critics of humanism and Enlightenment say, well, it's just too, is it arid? Is it tepid? Is it too flattened to get people's hearts pounding? Is the conquest of disease, famine, poverty, violence, and ignorance boring? Do people need to believe in magic, a father in the sky, a strong chief to protect the tribe, myths of heroic ancestors? Well, I don't think so. I dare say that applying knowledge and sympathy to enhance human flourishing is heroic, glorious, maybe even in its own way spiritual. It's not just a myth. Myths are fictions, and this one we can show is true to the best of our knowledge, which is the only truth we can have. And it's a hero story that belongs not just to one tribe, but to all of humanity, to any sentient creature with the power of reason and the urge to persist in its being. Because it depends only on the convictions that life is better than death, health is better than sickness, abundance is better than want, peace is better than war, happiness is better than suffering, and knowledge is better than superstition and ignorance. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, Professor Pinker. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for your lecture. Thank you for being here. You pointed out that many intellectuals are somehow against progress, against the views you develop in your book. Now, personally, I'm all in favor of progress, and I believe in reason and science and humanism, the pillars of the Enlightenment vision that you favor so much. So obviously I must not be an intellectual. But nevertheless, there's the question, I would like to elaborate on this. What is it that got into the mind of academically trained people for maybe the last 30, 40 years that makes them look so suspiciously towards progress? So there's a lot of postmodernism going on, relativism. There's no such thing as truth, according to many people, especially in the humanities, maybe. So I wonder, could you elaborate on this a little bit? Why that got into intellectuals' mind? Well, we have all the graphics and the data, so obviously there's some progress, right? But many people have a hard time to believe this. And I have also an additional question. You mentioned, of course, President Trump. There's no, you cannot go beyond him somehow these days. Yes. But would you say that there's a link between postmodernism, that whole view of there's no such thing as a reliable scientific method and so forth and so on the one hand, and the election of Trump? Because if you think about it, he doesn't believe in vaccination, he doesn't accept global warming, he has not much respect for facts, for scientific methodology, and so on. So maybe it's far-fetched to blame postmodernism for Trump, yes. But nevertheless, because that would be a very weird contradiction in a sense, that the liberal progressive people in the academic world somehow helped to create President Trump.
Yes, that would be an ultimate irony. So let me take the first question first. Why are so many, you're right, it's not all intellectuals by any means, but why is there widespread contempt for the idea of progress among many professors, social critics, editorialists? Partly it's that if you're not steeped in quantitative thinking, in statistical thinking, if you're not aware of the kinds of cognitive biases and fallacies that Tversky, Kahneman, and others have pointed out, then you can be just as much of a victim of the illusions of the world depicted by journalism as anyone else. You can say, well, no, there hasn't been progress. I just read yesterday about a famine here, a terrorist attack there, poverty in a third place, and unless you actually count the number of people who are killed in violence as a proportion of the world's population, percentage of people who are poor, and so on, you can be misled as anyone. But I think there's a deeper reason. And it's not just the last 30 or 40 years, although it has, I think, increased since the 1960s.
You mentioned Nietzsche, for instance. You would even go back to the 19th century to...
Yes, in the 19th century, there was early in the 19th century, in fact, even in the end of the 18th century, there was a romantic movement, that a counter-Enlightenment that arose in opposition to the Enlightenment, opposed to science and reason as opposed to emotion, universal human rights as opposed to national pride and blood and soil. This was often wedded to a narrative of decline in many thinkers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche and Oswald Spengler and Toynbee. And it was inherited by the existentialists, the Frankfurt School, and postmodernism, who dominate many parts of modern universities, especially in the humanities. And it's perhaps not all that surprising why they would be pessimists. It's a bit of a cynical explanation. But society has different elites. There are the technologists, there are the scientists, there's the military, there are the lawyers, there's the business people, the politicians, the intellectuals. And a lot of what's gone right is really not the responsibility of intellectuals and social critics. It is of medical researchers and engineers getting clean water, reducing infectious disease. And since there's always status competition, who gets to boast we're the most moral? To put down modern society, to deny that progress has occurred, is a backhanded way for people to put down their rivals. It's a way for business people to look down on politicians. It's a way for intellectuals to look down on business people. And it may explain something that has been observed for a long time. Hume pointed it out, Hobbes pointed it out, that intellectuals are always looking back to a golden age. And the reason is that to criticize the present is a backhanded way of criticizing your rivals. As Hobbes put it, men contend with the living, not with the dead. Second question, and indeed this would be a tremendous irony if we could blame Donald Trump on French literary theory. So not exactly, because I think it's pretty safe to say that Donald Trump has not read Derrida and Foucault. Probably not, or Jacques Lacan. However...
Good point for him, I would say.
Yeah. Right. But it is a supreme irony that the denial of objective truth, the proposing alternative facts, it all depends on, facts aren't facts, as Rudy Giuliani put it, could come out of the mouth of a French literary theorist. So why the convergence? Partly it's that they both hate liberals, but partly it almost sounds like an oxymoron to talk about the intellectual roots of Trumpism. But it is not totally crazy, because Trump was advised by people who consider themselves intellectuals, like Steve Bannon, like Michael Anton, and they actually do trace their ideas back to counter-Enlightenment thinkers, most prominently Nietzsche, who is a hero among the alt-right, a hero to Nietzsche, to many of the populist conservatives, and also via Heidegger and Sartre and others in the lineage that leads to postmodernism.
Yeah. Now, near the end of your talk, you mentioned the problem in the media that they tend to focus, of course, on the bad news and shootings and all that, and they never mention the good news. They don't show us any statistics or graphs and so on. Now, there seems to be kind of a trap thing in this, because how are you going to escape this? Because on the one hand, there's the way the media works, and on the other hand, there's human psychology who craves for these kinds of things. I can't help to point out there's also irony in this. I think I read this in an article by Kahneman that you mentioned. Whenever there's a shock attack, this saves on average about 10 lives, because less people are drowning. They don't go swim anymore because of the shock attack, so okay. Less people die. So every person that dies because of a shock attack saves maybe 10 people on average.
I didn't know that.
That's never mentioned in the media, of course, because, I mean, how are you going to do this? But the shock attack is mentioned. But the media, in a sense, can't afford to leave the shootings out. Like there just was a shooting in Thousand Oaks in California. This has been in the news here too. Although if you look at the statistics, it's horrible for these people, but it's a minor thing in a sense compared to the asthma deaths, for instance, that you mentioned, right? But the media cannot make a point of people dying of asthma. It's not the same thing as a rampage shooting. So also given human psychology, you pointed it out yourself. So how can communication specialists and people working in the media escape from this? Yeah. In the end, they have to sell their newspaper, right? Or they need the views.
Yes. Well, it's not as if, by the way, I should add that I strongly believe, despite my criticisms, the mainstream media are a lot better than the non-mainstream media in editing, in fact-checking, in correcting errors. So this is not a denunciation of the media across the board. But there are some bad habits. And in fact, it's not as if the mainstream media have found a formula for commercial success. The mainstream media are in tough shape. And one of the reasons is that people are saying more and more they can't bear to look at the news because it's so depressing. Now, maybe the world is depressing, and a lot about the world is depressing. But on the other hand, we're not talking about heartwarming stories about good Samaritans and a puppy befriends an orangutan and a policeman buys groceries for a single mother, the kind of heartwarming stories, which I find even more depressing, because if that's the best we could do, the world is really in bad shape. I mean things like a war ends between Eritrea and Ethiopia, killed 100,000 people. They've opened their borders. Several countries in South Asia have democratically replaced their leaders. There's a class of new drugs in the pipeline that will overcome antibiotic resistance. I mean, major stories. And trends such as the drastic reduction in global poverty, extreme poverty, the rise in literacy, which if the news was a little more fact-based, if they did not just report trends when there was an uptick or a downtick that reverses a trend, giving people the misleading impression that something is getting worse by reporting the 1 year in which it gets worse, ignoring the 20 years in which it gets better, then it would give people not only a more positive view of the world, and that shouldn't be the goal, because the goal should be a more accurate view of the world, but it would also go toward, I think, the 1/3 of people who say they avoid the news because it just lowers their mood for the rest of the day. It increases their anxiety, their depression, their helplessness, their numbness. It's hard to. I found in talking to journalists, many of them really have what is a completely irrational attitude that reporting positive news is not serious journalism. It's advertising, it's government propaganda, it's Pravda saying that wheat yields increased 10% last year. And this has got to stop. This is because it is irrational, and it has pernicious effects, including, and going back to whether the pessimism of intellectuals actually encourages the rise of authoritarian populism. One reason that it does, aside from whether Steve Bannon read Nietzsche, an entire other effect is that people who despise Donald Trump and European populists have become so cynical about the mainstream alternatives, the centrists, the liberal Democrats, the Christian Democrats, and so on, that they stay home on election day. They sit out elections, hand the election over to the people who are passionate about populism, because they mistakenly think there's no difference between, say, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. We now know there's an enormous difference, but if you're so cynical about liberal democracy, because both universities and journalism makes you think that everything is getting worse, then you just say, well, I'll just disengage. And I think that was a contributor.
Okay. Something you did not mention in your short talk, you didn't have time enough, I guess, is that you have a chapter in the book on what the Enlightenment somehow missed, in a certain sense. And you mentioned evolution, information, and entropy. Now, maybe this takes a long answer, but nevertheless, could you try to explain to us why they missed that and what's the point? I can see that they would have been informed even better about human nature. They were looking for a science of human nature if they would have had evolutionary theory. But of course, that only came later, and now we have evolutionary approaches to human behavior and human psychology and so on. And I'm sure, and I guess you agree, people like David Hume and many others would have loved it. They would have been evolutionary psychologists nowadays. But what about information and entropy? What's the relevance here for your story on progress?
Yeah, it's in advocating Enlightenment ideals. I by no means intend this to be a kind of idolatry of the Enlightenment philosophe, that we should parse their words and what did they really mean, and let's go back to them. No, I mean the idea is that we should continually expand our knowledge. That the Enlightenment was a process of encouraging reason and the growth of science. And there are obviously some things the Enlightenment thinkers could not possibly have anticipated, just as we can't anticipate the intellectual and scientific discoveries of the future. And I suggest in the book, I'll just mention them briefly, that there are three massive concepts that just had not been around at the time of the 18th century, although they did kind of think of some precursors. They didn't have the vocabulary or the technical concepts to identify them. And one of them is entropy, the fact that without input of energy and information, systems naturally tend toward disorder, because there are so many more ways for things to go wrong than to go right, with the implication that a lot of what goes wrong in human affairs cannot be blamed on some evildoer who wanted it to go wrong. Just leave things to their own devices and they'll rot, they'll collapse, they'll fall apart, they'll die. And so in addressing trouble in the world, we shouldn't always try to blame someone who caused it, but just realize that's what will happen unless you apply knowledge and energy. Evolution, well, Darwin's theory of natural selection obviously was unknown, although Hume came close. There's a passage in Hume in which he almost gets it. And information, the idea that you can make precise and quantify ideas, intellectual content, and understand the brain as an information processing device. Again, the Enlightenment thinkers often came close. In some of the British associationists, in Leibniz, who had mechanical metaphors for the mind, but they didn't have the concept of the bit and channel capacity and so on, which are foundations of modern cognitive science and neuroscience.
Would you agree with C.P. Snow of Two Cultures essay fame, that the fact that many people, well, intellectuals, people in the humanities and so on, are not at all familiar with, for instance, the concept of entropy, is part of the problem? Yeah,
so in many ways, Enlightenment Now is a kind of a revisiting of the two cultures 55 years after it was published, because I do take up a number of Snow's themes. One of them, that the great separation in modern universities between the humanities and the sciences gets in the way of understanding in both directions. And again, it's not just the humanities, because many parts of the humanities, such as analytic philosophy, linguistics, archaeology, are thoroughly integrated with science. But that should be more widespread. Snow's other point, which was remarkably prescient, was that science has the potential to enormously enhance human flourishing by the conquest of disease and poverty and child mortality in poor countries. And he pointed this out way before Bill Gates and Hans Rosling and the Millennium Development Goals, but he said there's huge suffering that we can figure out how to reduce it, and he was absolutely right and 50 years ahead of his time. He was also viciously attacked, by literary critics and other humanities professors, so much so that the Spectator, the British magazine, asked him to indemnify them against a libel charge if they published a critique of his book. They were afraid that he would sue them for libel. It was so vicious, and he said, yes, go ahead and publish it, to his credit.
We have another 5 minutes, which is okay, because I only have 26 more questions. I'm going to ask two more.
Yeah.
They're both complicated, I'm afraid, but, well, here they come. The first one is, can you say a little bit more about the relationship, or maybe the non-relationship in a sense, between inequality and poverty? For you, inequality is not the real issue. While many people, maybe more in Europe than in the United States, although I'm not sure, focus a lot on the problem of inequality. And there's that huge best-selling book by Thomas Piketty. Inequality is an issue in that book, of course. It has a huge following. It seems like a natural thing to do, to make the gap between poor people and rich people smaller, and then the rich people will be less rich, but that's okay, because they are very rich, and the poor people will be less poor, so everybody should be happy about that. You have a totally different view. For you, the problem is not so much inequality, but poverty itself, and you don't solve poverty by fighting or trying to diminish inequality. Is that correct, the way I pointed out here?
Well, I think on moral grounds, this is an argument that I took from moral philosophers, including Harry Frankfurt and Derek Parfit. What we should care about is poverty, how well people live their lives. And the gap between the rich and the poor is morally not as important as whether poor people suffer or live decent lives, whether they can feed themselves and clothe themselves and survive childbirth and so on. An analogy would be, you can also measure inequality in lifespan. In some countries, in some classes, people live longer than others. Should we reduce inequality in lifespan? Well, not exactly, because we could do that just by killing everyone over the age of 60. Then inequality would go way down. Would that be a good thing? Probably not. Likewise, when it comes to poverty, we ought to eliminate and reduce poverty, especially extreme poverty. That may, as a byproduct, reduce inequality, because one of the ways, not the only way, of reducing poverty is to have greater government social spending financed by a graduated income tax, which hits the rich more than the poor. It's not the only way to deal with poverty, and in fact, of the ways of reducing poverty, expanding economic output is far more effective than redistribution. The way that China went from a poor country to a middle-income country, and South Korea went from a poor country to a rich country, is not that they reshuffled resources, they grew their economies. So it's not that reducing inequality would be a bad thing, but it just should not be the target. Helping poverty should be the primary goal.
Okay. I have a question about religion. Did we have all this progress despite religion, or did religion play a positive role in all this? And then another question is, related to this, the cognitive science of religion seems to point out that there's a good scientific explanation for the existence of religion. It's kind of a side effect of certain psychological capacities we have. That leads certain people to the pessimistic view. We are all free thinkers here, so I can call it the pessimistic view, that we will never get rid of religion, because it's just a natural, normal side effect of the way our brain works. So I'm asking two questions here, but anyway, they're related.
Yeah. Well, given that religions were at least the religions that we recognize today, the big ones were around for thousands of years. Then the Enlightenment took place in the 18th century, leading to abolition of slavery, abolition of sadistic capital punishment, the rise of democracy, and so on. Nothing happened in religion that changed around that period, so it's hard to credit it to religion, except with one exception, which is that the European wars of religion in the late 16th and 17th century were so bloody and vicious and genocidal that people gave a lot of thought to how do we not do that again? And so a lot of the arguments for a secular basis for democracy among the Enlightenment thinkers alluded to the wars of religion as how not to do things. So there was that contribution. That having been said, it's not that religions are incompatible with the spread of humanism and Enlightenment values, because religions themselves change, or at least some of them do. So the ones that do, that repurpose themselves as humanistic institutions and concentrate on charity and education and ritual and community, can have a positive role to play, as long as they forget the part about executing homosexuals and prohibiting contraception and keeping women subservient to men and all of that stuff.
Yeah. You're asking a lot of a certain religion here, of course, right?
Yes. Well, a lot of religions have moved in that direction, but and the rest should. Okay. The other question, will there always be a need for religion? The way I think of it is that there will always be a vulnerability to religion because of certain features of the human brain. We tend to seek agency, causes for events. We have a theory of mind or an intuitive psychology, so we easily impute minds to other people, from which it's a short step to impute minds to things that don't actually have minds, like idols, like natural forces, like the weather. So given our need to explain, and given there'll always be kind of content providers who allude to disembodied minds as a way of explaining what we can't otherwise explain, we'll always be vulnerable to it, but it doesn't mean that there's a part of the brain that's adapted to Judeo-Christian dogmas. In terms of the overall trend worldwide, I did devote some time to that in the chapter on humanism, where there are trends that are going pulling in three different directions in terms of whether religion is ascending or declining. When people switch their affiliation, they overwhelmingly move away from religion. There's a huge trend for people to not say that they're atheists, because that's still a bit of a dirty word. Many people just can't, it just sticks in their throat. They just can't say they're atheists. But they'll say, I have no religion, I'm spiritual but not religious, and that category is hugely growing. On the other hand, people who are religious have more babies. And so that is a trend that pushes in the other direction. On the other hand, that could change, because as people get more educated, as they start to move to cities, and as women's empowerment increases, fertility declines.
And of course, there's no such thing as a Muslim baby or a Catholic baby, and so on. Right?
Okay. Quite right. Finally, I'll just let me mention one other thing, which is that the other illusion that religion is increasing is the fact that religious people are politically mobilized. They all vote, and they all vote for Donald Trump. At least the Christian evangelicals. Humanists, and I'm speaking to you, stay home on election day. Seculars don't vote. This is a huge problem. We've got to get humanists to vote.
Here in this country, you must vote.
Okay. Well, very good.
Now, we have to wrap it up, but I have a very, very short last question, which is, what will your next book be about?
Oh, I will just give a tease for the title. It is Don't Go There: Common Knowledge and the Science of Civility, Hypocrisy, Outrage, and Taboo.
Looking forward to it already. Steven Pinker, thank you very much.
Thank you.